I'm John Burnham Schwartz, Literary Director of the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and this is Beyond the Page. Once again, this past July, the Sun Valley Writers Conference took place in beautiful Sun Valley, Idaho, bringing together, as it does, some of the finest writers and thinkers in the world. The Writers Conference is always a remarkable event, but the 2023 conference, for a variety of reasons, somehow felt extra special. And so, over the next several months, we thought we would cherry-pick some of the most relevant and scintillating presentations and edit them down to episode length for you to listen to when you have the time. In this episode, three of our most cogent and influential writers on global affairs and history, Anne Applebaum, Robert Kagan, and Evan Osnos, discuss the geopolitical ramifications of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing battle between democracy and authoritarianism, Vladimir Putin's endgame, China's power plays, and the future of the Western Alliance, among other questions. Applebaum is a staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, the author of such books as Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, GULAG, A History, and most recently, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Kagan is a senior fellow at Brookings, a contributing columnist at the Washington Post, and the author, most recently, of The Ghost at the Feast, America and the Collapse of World Order, 1900 to 1941. Moderating the conversation is New Yorker staff writer Evan Osnos, author of Wildland, The Making of America's Fury, and the National Book Award-winning Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. Here they are at the 2023 Sun Valley Writers Conference.
Good morning, folks, and welcome back. Just a word on these two really remarkable thinkers, because they are, in so many ways, I think, relevant to the subject we're talking about to an extraordinary degree. Because when you look across their body of work, what you see is that there's a shared dynamic, which is that they're thinking about the undertow of history, the patterns, and then also our agency. And how do these two pieces fit together? Because you never let us off the hook by saying, well, this is an inevitability, this is destiny, this is not something that we have any control over. And at the same time, you call on us to say, but we must heed the lessons of our ancestors. In some ways, there are lessons there that we can't afford not to know. So we're going to talk about the implications of Ukraine, we're going to talk about authoritarianism and democracy, we're going to talk about some China, and ultimately what it means for the West. And I want to start, I think probably inevitably, with the moment last year, February 24th, 2022, when Vladimir Putin's armies marched into Ukraine. And I want to put the question to you both, beginning with you, Anne. How did the world change on that day? What questions did that reveal to us? What do we now confront? And what do you think is most significant for us to think about beyond the borders of Ukraine?
So first of all, thanks for the question. Delighted to be here again in this amazing crowd and this amazing place. You know, that night in February, and I'm now struggling to separate my personal memories of it, which were memories of staying up all night essentially and trying to call people on the telephone, with the broader story. It was a moment when I understood that Putin and an array of other autocracies were willing to challenge, what we rightly or wrongly refer to as the liberal world order. What Putin was doing by staging a full-scale invasion was saying, I don't care about your stupid rules. I don't care about your laws of war. I don't care about the Geneva Convention. And we would then see more evidence of that in the days to come. And not only that, I don't think you are going to stand up to me and stop it, because you don't really believe in those rules anymore either. And I have behind me, I have China, I have Belarus, I have Venezuela, I have Iran. I have an alliance of nations who are not an alliance in the old sense. I've once tried to describe that group almost as a business conglomerate. You can call it Autocracy Inc. So a group of dictatorships around the world that share sometimes very little. They share very little ideologically. They are not, you have theocratic Iran and nationalist Russia and, post-Maoist China and Bolivarian Venezuela.
I would point out their P&L is not looking very good right now.
Yes, but they are a group who share, they don't share many ideas, but they do share a dislike of us. And they dislike the rules that we made, and they dislike the rules that say they aren't allowed to invade their neighbors, they aren't allowed to rape and murder at will. And the invasion was an attempt to show that that group is winning, and that their way of running the world, which is not rule of law, it's rule by law. It's rule, law is whatever the dictator says it is. International law is whatever the strongest person says it is. And that order is now going to be imposed. That wasn't the only reason Putin invaded, but it was an important part of it. The fact that we were able to push back against it is also very significant, and I assume we'll be speaking about that next.
And that was not a foregone conclusion, in fact.
It was not a foregone conclusion, and on the night of February the 24th, I did not know how we would react.
Bob, what were you thinking about when that moment happened? Were you thinking historically? Were you thinking in contemporary terms? What surfaced for you as most significant?
Well, I have to say, February 24th for me, for very peculiar reasons, was not a big turning point, because I'm married to somebody who was in the U.S. government who had been telling me for 4 months that they were getting ready to invade. And so we spent most of our time, everybody was saying, no, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. And we kept thinking, I think it's going to happen. And so when it finally happened, it was like, okay, you see, it's happened. So... And I would say in another sense, the world didn't change, obviously, on February 24th, and Putin's behavior did not begin on February 24th. And you can trace his ambition to achieve this goal. I don't know how far you want to go, but if anybody wants to go back and read his statement at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where that was his real declaration of, I am going to defy this liberal world order. And then following that was the intervention in Georgia in 2008, and then hit Russian activity in Syria, but then again back with the Crimea. And so this has been moving for a while and reflects, we want to talk about ideas, and obviously it is about ideas, but there are also geopolitical realities here. I think, obviously Putin and many people in the former Soviet Union, but particularly in Russia, are not happy with the post-Cold War settlement because it drove Russian power back, and he wanted to try to reestablish. I think Putin sees himself as Peter the Great and would like to emulate that. So in terms of his motivation, I don't think it was as much about what he was going to do to us as what he was trying to do for Russia. But the other thing is, I'd like to step back just a second and maybe say some things that we're not comfortable with, which is his complaint, and it's not just his, it's the Chinese complaint and Iran's complaint and others, is that a liberal hegemony has been imposed on the world by force. And they're not wrong. Because we're sort of all Enlightenment liberals, we think that democracy is the end point of human progress. In reality, it's an aberration in human history. If you ask, who has history on their side? Putin has history on his side. Most governments throughout the history of the world have been autocracies. We think that democracy is the natural evolution of human beings, but there is no evolution of human beings, I think, as we've been hearing, perhaps. And it's not surprising that they want to push back at this hegemony. And we don't like to hear that because we just like to think, well, it's just people want to be free. And of course, many people do want to be free, but they are free in part today because of an assertion of military power, because of wars won, because of power extended. And that's the part of it that we're uncomfortable with, and that's the part of it that Putin actually targets, which is you're being a bully. From their point of view, we're the bullies, and he's trying to push back against the bullying. And I'm a liberal Democrat, so I'm cool with our hegemony, but I understand why he's not cool with our hegemony.
So do you see freedom as an unnatural state of nature?
I think that liberalism, which is what we're really talking about, and not liberalism like left-right liberalism, but the focus on our system is founded on the idea that individual rights are supreme over the state, over the community even, and by the way, even over democracy. That is the rarest thing in the world. The American Revolution was the most radical revolution in history, much more so than the French, because it was a radical assertion of the principle of universal rights, which in many ways is antithetical to human nature. Everybody wants their own rights represented. Maybe they want their family members' rights represented. Maybe they want people to look like them, believe like them. But others, they're not so sure about. And I would say all over the world, and including in this country, we are having a fight between liberalism and people who are not so sure that they like it.
You know, when we talk about Putin and his motives and his thinking, you know, I often go back to that moment when there was crisis in Moscow. He was a KGB officer in Dresden. He's feeding documents into a furnace at the moment that the Soviet Empire is in effect becoming defunct. And he's having, that is sort of the true origin moment of his project. And yet, it took until 2023 in an environment in which that somehow became possible for him to do it, which gets us to an interesting fact, which is that we are living in this moment when there is something happening about democracy and authoritarianism. And I think we have to talk about that. I mean, here we are on a morning when people are in the streets of Israel right now because of a vote that was taken today, very controversial vote to narrow the powers of the Supreme Court, as people here will know. Tom Friedman this morning described it as essentially the biggest challenge to democracy in Israel since its founding. You look at democracy and authoritarianism and you say this is not unique to Ukraine. It's happening all over the place in democracies. And my question is why?
Again, first of all, one of the mistakes that we often make in the United States is to imagine that our problems and our arguments are completely unique. And even at some of the panels here at this conference, I've heard people explain American politics by reference to American history. You know, we're playing out the 1960s or we're playing out the Civil War. And of course that's true. But it doesn't explain something else, which is why in so many countries we have very similar politics to those of the United States. So I spend part of my time in Poland and part of my time in Washington, and never in my whole life did I imagine that Polish politics, which are, you know, where there's nothing, you know, there's no cultural similarity, there's no demographic similarity, there's no religious similarity. Nothing is similar between Poland and the United States, and yet Polish politics and American politics seem very similar. And you just have to take my word for it. Same language, same arguments, same grievances, sometimes, you know, same memes. And some of that is a phenomenon that I think we didn't expect when we first started talking about globalization a couple of decades ago, which is that it's not just, you know, Democrats and liberals who learn from one another around the world, it's also autocrats who learn from one another around the world. So one of the things happening in Israel today is that Netanyahu is doing a kind of a sort of fake judicial reform, which bears an amazing resemblance to the Polish fake judicial reform that took place a few years ago, and the Hungarian fake judicial reform as well. So they are able to share, they watch what one another does, they imitate it, and they share ideas and tactics. And this happens in the level of illiberal democracies. It also happens between autocracies. They simply borrow ideas and one another's playbooks. But I think we're also living at a time of unbelievably rapid change. And the change is social, and again, it's demographic, and it's informational. The way in which we get and perceive politics is now fundamentally different from how it ever was before in history. The only really comparable moment is really the invention of the printing press. Maybe you can talk about the invention of radio at the beginning of the 20th century. And because that phenomenon is happening in so many places as well, you're getting a similar reaction. So the reaction to rapid change is very often a kind of nostalgia or backlash. You know, things were better before, or the new elements in our society are the ones that we need to repel. Whether those new elements are new immigrants, or whether they're gay rights laws, or whether they're women's emancipation, whatever it is, it differs a little bit from society to society. But one of the reasons why these same memes and same tactics and same responses are occurring in different places is that the kinds of change happening are also the same. And I think that's a part of the explanation.
You said last year you testified in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and you said, all of us have in our mind a cartoon image of what an autocratic state looks like. There's a bad man at the top, he controls the police, but in the 21st century, the cartoon bears little resemblance to reality. And I'm interested, what is the architecture actually of an authoritarian turn in the 21st century? It's made of different instruments than the ones.
So, I mean, you have in most states, you have a kind of kleptocratic class. And they interact with the kleptocrats in other classes, including in our country. So the kleptocrats know how to launder money. They know how to move it from Russia to the Cayman Islands to Liechtenstein, to Saudi Arabia. You also have
Can we talk about yachts, by the way? Is that possible? Just sorry. Go on.
You have, in each one of these countries, you have a class that thinks about propaganda. They buy and sell one another's troll farms. They use the same bots. They study the techniques of creating political division, of isolating people, of trolling people. And this is, of course, not confined to autocracies. I have a Mexican friend who's a kind of democratic activist there, who's trolled and attacked online in the same way that people are trolled and attacked online in Saudi Arabia, or Turkey or Hong Kong. There's a kind of enterprise of propaganda that they share among one another as well. There's also a kind of apparatus of surveillance. There are Chinese surveillance technologies that are bought and sold quite easily, are used in, all over Africa, are used all over Latin America. And so each one of these states, they are interconnected, as I said, almost like a big corporation, even when they're ideologically very different and even when they're historically not aligned. What is the historical relationship between Iran and Venezuela? Zero. But now, the Iranians invest in Venezuela. There's an exchange of diplomats between Iran and Venezuela. Belarus and Cuba, same thing. These aren't necessarily places that traditionally had anything in common with each other, but they do have in common this need to share the apparatus of repression. And as I said before, although I accept what you say about there being big geopolitical issues and issues of power as well, the dislike of liberalism and the dislike of us is one of the things that unites them. And by that I mean it's a dislike of their own democracy activists. What is Putin most afraid of? He's most afraid of the thing that happened in Ukraine in 2014, which was a mass uprising of people shouting about corruption and wanting to join the EU. That's the thing he fears most in Russia. And so part of what he's doing by attacking democratic principles and the democratic world, and I agree with you completely, I think it began 2 decades ago, even before 2006, 2007. The thing he's doing there is trying to establish the legitimacy of his own power. And for a lot of them, the legitimacy of their own power now has an international aspect. So part of defending themselves at home is attacking democracies abroad or defending other autocracies abroad.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, we're saying the same thing in different ways. But at the end of the day, to some extent, for the leaders at least, it is about power. And if we want to understand why Venezuela and Iran and all these others are getting along, it's because they're the only ones that they're allowed to deal with without being told you can't do this. They're not, China doesn't have a problem with Iran's autocracy. We have a problem with Iran's autocracy, and that gets in the way. So in a certain sense, they're trying to find the corners where they can get help. By the way, I don't think, having Belarus and Venezuela and Iran on your side is a winning formula in global politics.
It is a heck of a bumper sticker.
It's a sign of their weakness and our. Again, I'm sorry to use this word, but the strength of the liberal hegemony has been demonstrated in a very profound way. And getting back to your original, your opening remarks. Whatever else is true, February 24th revealed the vibrancy of the liberal democratic world order. And you're right to say I personally had some doubt about that vibrancy because there are challenges to liberal democracy within all the liberal democracies. And so the fact that on the liberal democratic side of the ledger in the world, they are seeing the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a challenge to their world order, that's to me very heartening, because it's easy for different countries to say, well, I'm okay, I don't care what's happening to you. But there is this sense of common solidarity against a common threat, which is ideological. It's also geopolitical, but it is very much ideological.
And can you help me reconcile something, Bob, which is, I think, the fascinating puzzle, which is at the very moment, as we were all talking backstage, that the authoritarian question is at least as present in our country as it is in other places, that at the very moment where we're contending with that, we also managed to find it within ourselves to mount this response to the invasion of Ukraine to a degree that surprised you and surprised many of us. How do these two pieces coexist? And I'll ask it more bluntly, if it had not been the president we have in office now, do you think there is a scenario by which we would not have responded the way we did?
It's a great question, and it's a question in some way cannot be answered with a theory. It's a historical reality, and it'll shift according to, and because I just spent many years writing about the period in the 20s and 30s, the debate we're having over, which is not only a geopolitical question about whether we want to do something about some horrible thing that's happening, but what does it say about us, and how are we breaking out as a people on this issue? In the late 1930s, the country was divided between people who thought the biggest danger was Hitler and the fascists, and the people who thought the greatest danger was the Soviet Union and the communists. And there was not unanimity on the subject of whether we should be going to the defense of Britain and the other democracies. And the way people responded to those external questions was heavily, and I would say primarily, driven by the debate that they were having inside the United States. And so today, a certain kind of, are we allowed to say Trump? I know nobody ever says the word Trump in this conference, but
I'm sorry, my speaker it cut out.
I'm sorry, that's right, I know.
Sorry, Bob. Who?
But the people who follow, their primary belief is that they are the victims of a liberal oppression at home, and many of them have decided to view the war in Ukraine as a liberal war. This is part of an extension of the liberal hegemony and oppression that they feel at home, and they are on Putin's side. Whether they want to say it openly or not, some do. Tucker Carlson has no problem with it, but other people may be a little more shyer than Tucker. As I say, the most important thing to understand, and this is always true of American foreign policy, American foreign policy is always a reflection to some extent of the debates that we are having in the United States.
If I can just say, I think that's true of almost any country. Yeah, sure. And so, why did Russia invade Ukraine? It was partly for internal reasons. It was Putin's way also of fighting liberalism, of fighting the democratic revolution in Ukraine that had taken place in 2014. He wants to show Russians that's never going to happen here. You pay a huge price for even wanting democracy, and look what I'm going to do to Ukraine right now. And people make this mistake often of looking at foreign policy like each country is a piece on a game board, and they don't have any internal politics, and it's just this is a large piece and that's a small piece, and therefore you can induce everything about them. And actually you have to look at what's happening inside the country to understand what they're doing abroad. Just
to say, Putin made a miscalculation about what the big threat to his regime was, apparently, because it was not from liberals, it was from people named Prigozhin, who's not especially liberal as far as I could tell.
He means well.
And here he is, Yevgeny Prigozhin. That really would be an amazing get. Is Putin weakened by the Prigozhin initiative, whatever we want to call it?
Yes.
Fundamentally weakened, or tactically, strategically has some work to do at home? How much do you think it changes the course of the war?
I don't know yet, but the facade that he portrayed to Russians of being in control of everything is now broken. And that simply gives opportunities for others. Maybe not the same for other insurrections or other violent events to come, but for small things that we won't necessarily see, right? Okay, so this guy isn't going to last forever, so I better start worrying about plan B. Maybe I should get my business out of the country. Maybe I should start making a different arrangement. It will affect how people, especially people in Moscow, plan their futures.
I have to tell you, this actually is the perfect segue because I wanted to shift to the subject of China, because we're talking about this kind of grand global question of whether there is, in fact, an authoritarian crescent that the United States is contending with or confronting. How much do you think we should learn about China from what's happened in Ukraine? And I'll make a provocation at the outset, which is I think that there is a risk of us assuming that we understand the Chinese rationale and the set of domestic decision-making elements based on what we've seen in Russia. And to your point, these places have domestic politics too. I've watched, as you know, we all live in Washington, I've watched as there's been a kind of casual assumption over the last year that Putin into Ukraine equals Xi Jinping into Taiwan, therefore we should do X, Y, and Z. How do you think about China today, Bob, and how it fits into what we're talking about?
Well, again, you know, China's position on Taiwan today did not begin with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And China's position on Taiwan is one of many decades, and they have been waiting with varying degrees of patience for Taiwan to do what it's supposed to do and reunite with the mainland. And unfortunately for them, the Taiwanese move further and further away. But we may ask questions about what is the demonstration effect on Chinese decision-making of having seen what happened to Putin. And I'm sure it's given them pause because, Russia in a way has a more tested military than China does. And the fact that the Russians so miscalculated and so badly handled this has got to make you wonder whether it's as easy to take over these small countries as you might think. However, China's trajectory has been clear for decades. It is still the same today. They believe that the world is in a very unnatural condition. The natural condition of the world, from their point of view, based on almost 2 millennia of it being like this, is that China should be the regional hegemon of East Asia and everybody else in the region should be subservient. They will never accomplish that goal as long as Taiwan is independent. And so, again, sorry to talk about geopolitics, but Chinese geopolitics has been consistent. Now, China, of course, is also in the position of being threatened by the liberal world order and wants to push back on it. I don't even know whether I just answered any question that you was asking.
Well, you were speaking in Mandarin, which was challenging for some people. I have to say, I look at what's happened over the last 15, 16 months, and I sort of put myself into the mind of Xi Jinping, who, of course, has said Vladimir Putin is my closest friend. You know, he's paid 30-plus visits to Putin over the years, meetings of one kind or another. Friend, yeah, I don't think it's warm and fuzzy, but they have a certain strategic sympathy with one another, and a temperamental sympathy, actually. But, and this is a piece that this is often lost, I think, on the outside, is that the Chinese are irritated immensely by the Russian posture towards them. You know, they say, Russia, you have an economy the size of New York State. You're no longer the big brother in this relationship. And that gives them a certain amount of mobility that, I mean, from a diplomatic perspective, from an American perspective, I wonder whether we're fully exploiting the opportunity to see if there is space between them.
I was in China now about a decade ago and had a conversation with a Chinese official who more or less described to me, and this is 10 years ago, the Russians as kind of bunch of Siberian peasants. You know, they come here in their fancy cars and they think they impress us, something along
That doesn't sound like a
lines.
compliment, I think.
No, it wasn't. The one parallel that I think is interesting, and actually I'd love to know what you think about this because you're the real expert on China on this panel, is Xi Jinping seems to be about to confront the kind of problem that Putin began to confront a few years ago, which is the end of an economic boom. So for Putin's first 10 years in power, he benefited enormously from rising oil prices. And he genuinely, made the pensions were being paid on time, people's salaries were going up, and part of his legitimacy was based on that achievement. It was at the moment when that began to end and when he began to get more pushback, I think at many levels inside Russia, that he began to turn more frequently and more loudly to the nationalist and imperialist ideas that he, I think, harbored all along. And I'm wondering if that threat might not be there for Xi Jinping as well. In other words, if China begins to have real economic trouble, will he not be tempted to say, okay, my legitimacy up until now has been based on my ability to deliver prosperity. Once I'm not able to do that, I have to offer someone something else, and maybe that's conquest.
I can tell you that, we look at the economic indicators of China, and it's pretty clear right now that they're not going back to the days of the growth that they had a decade ago. We know that. It's heading in one clear direction that's defined partly by demographics. But the fascinating indicator that very much chimes in the same direction is that it's not just an economic problem. It's a malaise of a really deep kind, particularly among young people. There's very high unemployment among young college graduates, but the really interesting indicator is that you remember that they relaxed the policy on having one child. It was now 2 children. Eventually they said, we're really encouraging people to have children because they're facing this very significant, very clear problem. They're not going to have enough working age population to support their retirees. They've started giving actual subsidies, inducements for people to have children. You remember how you have children. It usually doesn't require a financial inducement. And it's not working. And I will tell you that among Chinese friends and analysts, that is a sign that something really fundamental is happening, and that's where you get into the geopolitical question. And the question is, does Xi Jinping then say, I'm going to try something, a gambit sort of like Xi Jinping, or like Vladimir Putin, or does he look at it and say, I'm not a risk, I don't have the same appetite for risk, I have too much to lose, I haven't fought a war since 1979, and we lost that one against the Vietnamese. We're not doing that.
Pulling back to Russia for a second, we were talking about what threatens Putin. We know how Russian governments fall to revolution. They fall in the middle of wars they are losing. I mean, 1917 was the reason the Russian Revolution was driven by the military's refusal to keep fighting, and there was another revolution in 1905, which was a consequence of the Russo-Japanese War. The problem, if you're Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, is that America can lose a war and the president loses his election, but we go on. If China were to do badly in a war with Taiwan, Xi Jinping is finished, and maybe the Communist Party of China is finished. I mean, these are the kinds of things that lead to revolution, and I can only hope that his incentive to want to do it and solve a lot of these problems is outweighed by the potential downside consequence of not doing well.
I want to bring it back to something that we started with, which is this, in some ways, the surprising reaction that we saw in the United States and in the Western alliance about responding to Ukraine. And here we are now in the second year of the war, and there is some wobbliness in various places, particularly among some conservative politicians. You heard Ron DeSantis say that it was a territorial conflict. What happens if the United States stops supporting Ukraine at the level that it has? What happens to Ukraine? What happens to the United States? What happens to the rest of the world?
I'm going to be very technical in the answer and say that we don't know yet, because that isn't going to happen until after the inauguration at the beginning of 2025, if it happens at all.
The inauguration? Oh, sorry. No, I was getting carried away.
Whatever. I mean, I'm saying that, so there. I don't believe that as long as Joe Biden is president, there will be a policy change in Ukraine. Partly for the reasons that we've been talking about. I mean, I think that he sees it as a reflection of who he is, and we're very lucky right now that at least the leaders of the major European countries also see it as a reflection of who they are. The French government, the British government, and the current German government also all, in their case, there's a security threat, but there's also a feeling that, the definition of who we are, again, as democracies, as members of NATO, as members of the European Union, requires us to behave this way. And so I am not worried about wobbliness unless there's a change of government, and unless a party comes to power which doesn't believe in those things. And here we do have the possibility that we could have a different kind of president. We have that possibility, in France or Germany, although there's no immediate election. I don't see it right now in Britain, but you can see it if there was an internal political change. And we're still some time away from that possibly theoretically happening here. And by that moment, the war will be also at a different stage. So it's a hard question to answer. I mean, one of the reasons why I think the US and others have put some pressure on Ukraine, really to do well this year and to take back territory this summer and this autumn, is because they are afraid of, the US presidential election starting and this becoming an electoral issue. So that is an aspect in how the US talks to Ukraine. But I don't see the US not supporting Ukraine, as long as Biden is president.
But Putin does, I
Yes.
think. And so one of the problems is that if you wanted to say, when is Putin going to tire of this? Because, it's not going well still. Unfortunately, now I think the answer is he's not going to tire of it until he sees who wins the election in 2024. And so he is going to hang in there in the hope and expectation that he'll have a different president, and at the very least, a different tenor of American foreign policy. Problems with the alliance, that guy who I'm not supposed to say, he had said that he would pull out of NATO, and I think this time he may have a better chance of implementing that policy with people that he's going to put in place rather than the people he inherited who really sort of talked him out of it. So the bad news from our point of view is whatever happens in 2024, Putin is hanging on to see what happens in 2024.
All of us wonder where this war ends up, and you mapped out a scenario the other day in which Crimea becomes the central battleground. One of the theories that people talk about is the idea that actually eventually this is going to be like the Korean Peninsula, the idea of a war that never really ends, but is essentially partitioned, that you have a demilitarized zone, an armistice of some kind, but you never really have an end to the war. Does that seem like a plausible scenario to you guys?
The difficulty with that is right now, I don't see why either side could accept that. At the moment, it's not just that the Ukrainians won't stop fighting, it's that the Russians don't want to stop fighting. And so officially, the Russian goal, which was the destruction of all of Ukraine and the annexation of Ukraine, in essence, remains the raison d'etre of the war. He has not changed that goal. And so before we're at a stage where we could negotiate something like the Korean Peninsula, there would have to be a change of heart inside Russia. And I still think that in order to get to that, the Ukrainians need there has to be some kind of political victory, or at the very least, there needs to be some kind of political change in Moscow, by which I don't necessarily mean regime change. I mean, the Russians have to decide that the war was a mistake, or that, they're going to stick with Crimea and give up everything else, or that there has to be a moment when they recognize that the imperial war was a failure, and we have not come to that moment yet.
Is this Putin's war or is this Russia's war?
It's clearly Russia's war. I mean, you can't execute a war like this without the support of many millions of people. However, I can conceive of leaders of Russia, including people who aren't very nice and aren't very liberal and wouldn't like us very much, and we wouldn't like them, but I can conceive of some people like that who would think the war was a mistake. So what we need is not necessarily liberal democracy in Russia. What we need is a leader of Russia who thinks the war is a mistake. And that's, I think, not impossible.
Bob, what's your thoughts on end state scenarios?
The historian in me is really reluctant to try to answer that question because there are so many variables that it's very hard to. I mean, again, after a month into the war, when it was clear that the Russians were bogged down, the question on my mind is, where is Lenin? And for a moment, I hope Prigozhin was Lenin. Not because I like Lenin, by the way, right? But just because I think, we're waiting for someone to take advantage of the obvious fact that the war is not going well, that the soldiers can't possibly be happy, and that the military may crack at some point. And there needs to be, somebody has to pop up and say, okay, this is not going well. Now, whether that person is Putin is not inconceivable, but unlikely. So there's going to have to be, as Anne says, a kind of rearrangement of the power structure so that the people who think that we really ought to stop doing this, are in the ascendant.
Yeah, the question of what is in Putin's deepest motives is always an interesting one. I went to Ukraine in 2014 with then Vice President Biden, and I interviewed him on the way back, and he told this story about meeting Putin at the Kremlin in 2011, and he says to Putin, Putin has a sort of fancy office, and Biden is kind of poking at him. He says, boy, it's a pretty gorgeous office. It's pretty nice what the free market can deliver, right? And he gets no reaction. And then he says, an additional provocation, he says, Mr. President, I'm looking into your eyes, and I don't see a soul. To which Putin replies, I'm glad we understand one another.
He made that up.
I have to say, I said to him, I said, that sounds a little too good, actually. But he said, no, absolutely, positively.
Well, that's the note to end on. Thanks for listening to Beyond the Page. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or review. A good one, we hope. To catch all the latest from the Sun Valley Writers Conference, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to listen to any of our other talks, you can find them at svwc.com. I'm John Burnham Schwartz. Until next time.